Hello. Hello again, class. Dr. Jones coming at you from sunny quarantine. So, our discussion for this week, I've been telling you for weeks that so much of what we talked about all semester in class was really leading up to this point. And so this is another really great week to process all of the things that we've learned. I know over the semester, lots of you have had questions just about I don't know what I expected in my Foundations of Education class, but this is a lot of history. And I say, yes, again, I told you from the beginning, I'm a historian. I love history. But also hopefully now you're starting to put together all of the reasons to learn the history. And we're going to be talking more about that this week. So your reading for today, just to preface, this is one of my favorite things to share with people. Just a little bit from my own personal story. I know you love those. As I was working on my PhD in education, at different times, before our new normal, I would travel to different conferences and stuff like that. And when I would meet a stranger and tell them oh, I'm getting a PhD in education, that 80% of the time, not exaggerating, people would respond with something like, okay, so what do we do about education, or what is wrong with our schools? And that's not surprising. We all are familiar with this narrative that there's something going on with our schools, that they're not creating the best and brightest minds in the world anymore. I don't really argue with that perspective, but at the same time, it usually made me frustrated because there is so much that goes into the answer to that question. And hopefully through the history, you've seen some of the complicated answers to that question. What I like about your reading for today, which is called From the Achievement Gap to the Education Debt, is Gloria Ladson Billings, who I believe this is our first time reading something by her in this class. Gloria Ladson Billings finds a way to create this metaphor, this analogy for answering that question, essentially. And so, let me set it up for you. Though you are going to read it, it kind of helps to kind of go in understanding the premise a little bit. So, Gloria Ladson Billings talks about how everybody is familiar with this idea of the achievement gap. You don't have to be a PhD in education, you don't have to be an education student even, to know that there is a discernible gap between the opportunities, between the outcomes, between the performance, everything, all of the positive markers of education, between minority students and white students. And what she argues is that even though everybody understands this, it's they're understanding a small portion of the problem, and they think that that small portion of the problem is the whole problem. And if you're only looking at a small portion of the problem, it's kind of impossible to even understand the whole problem and how to address the whole problem, which is the most important part. So she makes this analogy. She says that focusing on the achievement gap, like so many of us do, whether you are a student or a professional, is like focusing on an individual year's deficit. So so many of us are familiar with the national debt. We know that it's this big number. We know that it's out of control at different times, and we know that it's a problem that needs to be addressed and needs to be constantly in our minds as we're doing things, right? And so she's arguing that when we're looking at the achievement gap, we act like we're looking at the big problem, like the national debt. But what we're actually looking at is 1 year's deficit. So a budget deficit is when you spend more money than you're taking in. So like the achievement gap, it's just evidence that there's something wrong here. There is definitely a difference between the educational outcomes of minority students and white students. But looking at the achievement gap is just like looking at, well, what went wrong this one year versus looking at the national debt, where it's like, well, how does all of the effects of what went wrong each year add up to something bad, something that we need to pay attention to? And so she argues that instead of being super familiar with this idea of the achievement gap, that's just like looking at one measure of inequality in our schools, we need to be looking at the larger picture. And so the larger picture that she breaks down for us is what she calls the educational debt. And so like that is the big concept that we're looking at today. So she divides the educational debt into 4 categories. I don't know if I have this exactly in the right order, that you're going to read it, but I'm going to talk about the 4 categories a little bit, again, to kind of help you think about them before you read this. But I highly, highly suggest like reading all of this article pretty closely. It's not one of the longer ones, and it's easier to read because you're reading a bunch of examples, but those are going to really help you out in this sense. So she puts the educational debt into 4 categories. 1, historical. And basically what the historical debt is talking about, it's talking about historical policies, historical events, historical attitudes that have led to inequality in our school system and in our schools. And so she talks about a lot of specific examples, but we've also talked about a lot of historical examples of this educational debt. And so that one is maybe like the easiest to fully understand. Like, yes, this history leads to things being harder for minorities in schools. I'm sure each and every one of you can make that argument, and with lots of different points. The next part, socio-political. And so by socio-political, she's talking about how in various ways minorities have not had the same access to our social rights, our civil rights, our political rights. And that creates various problems for our educational system. And so she gives you lots of examples of how the socio-political debt, not having access to those rights, and to, you could even say, a measure of respect and dignity in our public life, has created, again, a problem for our educational system. Next is the economic debt. And this is, again, one that people it's a little easier to understand, that when we talk about the economic debt, we're talking about like literally dollars and cents, how our system that makes it harder for minorities to generate wealth, pass down wealth, and all of these things, and concurrently makes it easier for white people to do those things, has created a certain debt in our educational system. If we just look at property tax value and how it is connected to our schools, we see that the economic debt, again, adds to this larger picture of the educational debt. And so lastly, she talks about a moral debt. And this is maybe my most favorite, because I feel like it's the one that people don't want to deal with. And by the moral debt, she talks about how various times we did something that we knew was wrong. We knew was going to hurt people in the long run. We knew it was going to hold some people back while supporting other people. And we did it anyway. And I feel like when it comes to the moral debt, people are less inclined to do something about it. Like There are ways that we have addressed historical debts and socio-political debts. We might not have been completely successful, but there were ways for us to really address those. With the moral debt, I feel like so many things fall through the cracks, and that's why I think it's maybe the most important to think about, because even though it's harder for us to address as a whole society, it doesn't take away the very real impact of those moral debts. So for our discussion today, I want you, for each of the parts of the educational debt, the historical, the socio-political, the economic, and the moral, I want you to think of a specific example from one of our readings in class that fits in with that type of debt. She lists a lot of examples in her reading. I want you to challenge yourself to think of some examples that she doesn't specifically list. So you might want to go back and look through your QCQs. You might want to go back and look through your notes from class and think about what are some really unique examples of the historical debt. Excuse me, again, not sick at all. Anyway, of the historical debt, the socio-political debt, the economic, and the moral. So your first task is to find a unique example from each of those. And then your second task is to explain what part of the debt do you think is most important and why. And so in this answer, I don't want like one sentence, I want several sentences. Explain why. Like, I think the socio-political debt is the most important one that we need to pay attention to because minorities have not always had the opportunity to be represented in Congress, and that has led to XYZ. I want you to be as specific as possible. Give me at least 4 to 5 sentences on which part of the debt that you think is most important, that you think that we need to address. I'd also be interested in you applying that to the times that we're living in now, these pandemic, the quarantine times that we're living in. Do you think that those exasperate a certain part of the debt? Do they make it worse? What is something that we definitely need to pay attention to in dealing with the extra challenges that we're dealing with now, especially as we think about equity and equality in our schools? So now to talk about your readings for Thursday. So you have a choice between 2 readings, and they're both really, really good. They're both equally good. First one, and I'll explain to you how you should choose which one you should read. The first one is called Tale of Three States. And so this is an example of, if you are interested in more of a macro, statewide idea of specifically how funding works to make our schools better and worse, I would choose this reading. So the first one is for if you want a statewide view, like I want to understand it from this perspective, how states can both help and hurt their schools by using funding in different ways. So the second article that you can choose from for your QCQ for Thursday is called Organizing for Success. And so this is more of the micro view. If you want a school-wide view of how schools can organize to address some issues within the educational debt, or she also has an examples of how organizing can completely hurt these issues of the educational debt. So I want you to choose one of those, decide whether you want a wider view or a smaller view. And also with your QCQs, I want you to connect it to our discussion of the educational debt. So maybe in your QCQ, say something about like, well, when states invest in this way in their teachers, it's addressing this part of the educational debt, or when a school organizes in this way, it is hurting or helping this part of the educational debt, and explain why. I'm really interested in seeing how you make these connections, because again, this is why we've done all of this work all semester. Like, we've read the history, we've been putting it together, we've analyzed it for differential racialization, we've analyzed it for the different ways that education can be used as an act of warfare. And we're here to this point of, okay, so now that we know this larger context for all of these problems, what are schools today doing about it? And do we think that what schools are doing is taking into account this historical context that has a big impact? These are the questions I want you to be thinking about in these last few weeks of the semester. So those are your focuses for today. I hope that you all are having a good day and staying safe and all of those things. Enjoy. I will look forward to reading your discussion today and on Thursday. Have a great one.